So coming to moderate a star panel on this issue that we've assembled to give you the information that you need about Common Core, would you please welcome Common Core Coalition Manager at the Family Research Council and her panel, Sarah Perry.
Good morning, everyone. Well, I know you've been welcomed, but I'm going to welcome you again because I'm very excited about what we're going to speak about today. I am Senior Fellow and Common Core Manager for Family Research Council, and we are very invigorated by your presence here, Common Core, the government's classroom. What your attendance signifies is your willingness to join beliefs and action, ideals and deeds to help preserve not only the bedrock American value of limited government, but our nation's most precious treasure, its children. We are ensuring the prosperity and the longevity of constitutional America through the next generation. So our goal today is to educate you on the failings of Common Core and to encourage your activism against it because so very much is at stake. Common Core is an issue that ought to raise the consciousness of even the most casual political spectator. What was once a quietly instituted but sweeping paradigm for educational reform has become very nearly a radioactive issue. It has become a marquee issue in elections, and it promises to be a bellwether in the 2016 races. But why Common Core's increased visibility? Because, as it turns out, if you tell us how we ought to educate our children, we will have something to say about it. We were once told that federal meddling in education was best for our children, best for commerce, and perhaps most critically, our own idea. We were sold whole cloth on the concept that state educational benchmarks needed to be chucked in favor of an initiative that arose from corporate educrats whose interests were intrinsically tied to the standards themselves. Uniform, unchangeable, low-bar standards that, in the word of Bill Gates, were geared toward creating a large, uniform base of customers. Let me briefly summarize the initiative for those of you who are not familiar with it. The Common Core state standards were introduced to the nation in 2009 by way of $4.3 billion in Race to the Top stimulus funding and waivers from the requirements of the No Child Left Behind Act. The National Governors Association and the Council of Chief School State Officers led the development process for uniform standards in math and English language arts for K-12 students, with nearly $200 million in support from the Gates Foundation. Let it be noted that the NGA and the CCSSO are trade organizations. They are unions. They have no legislative authority. Desperate for an injection of funding in a flailing economy, 45 states and the District of Columbia quickly signed on. But the final draft of the standards was not released until after the applications were due, leaving states ignorant as to what the standards would actually entail. In fact, Illinois, Mississippi, and Oklahoma had to bypass their own state constitutions and enact emergency legislation in order to apply for funding. These are the facts of Common Core. Now, to the philosophies behind it. Opposition to this initiative was once decried as misguided. Opponents were called everything from disgruntled white suburban mothers, I wear that badge proudly, to members of fringe political factions. But resistance to the Common Core has grown exponentially. Critics on both ends of the political spectrum recognize its shortcomings because all of us want better prepared students and better academics. We all want children better prepared for the world into which they will enter upon graduation. But the reality of Common Core is a test-heavy, corporate, industrialized approach to education. It requires an invasion of students' privacy, through longitudinal data collection. It offers a set of subpar academic standards, and it further entrenches a disturbing trend toward federally led education. Common Core does not value the student as an individual. Instead, Common Core treats every student as an identical component in the economic machine, a future government worker, a test score. So today I have the privilege of introducing you to three policy analysts who are presenting an articulate and intelligent response to Common Core. These are individuals with vast experience in the study of education reform, and I'm going to direct to them some questions that will help you better understand what this critical debate is about. I will ask our panelists to introduce themselves and give a brief summary of what their work on Common Core entails. So we'll welcome our panelists to the stage. Neal, if you don't mind kicking us off.
Sure, I can kick. You want to know a little bit about me, the Tea Party? I mean, not the Tea Party. Sorry about that. I mean, the opposite of the Tea Party, the Common Core.
Let's just start with simple introductions and what your work is entailing at your respective organizations.
Sure. Well, unfortunately, I work at the Cato Institute. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Educational Freedom. And unfortunately, much of my work over the last several years has been all about Common Core. Because Common Core is clearly the biggest threat to what my organization, or at least the people in it, and me especially, want, which is school choice for everyone. We want education to be driven by parents and families, and Common Core is the opposite of that, and so I've just spent an absurd amount of time on Common Core, but at Cato we also do school choice. We like homeschooling, we like vouchers, we like tax credit programs. And ultimately, what we want is people to drive their own educational choices.
Excellent. Lindsey.
Thanks for being here today. I'm the Will Skillman Fellow in Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. And like Neal's work, our work really runs the gamut. Although I do feel like I've spent the past 5 or 6 years doing nothing but thinking about Common Core and pushing back on Common Core. But our work at Heritage goes from everything from pre-K policy through K-12 policy and higher education policy. So we cover all of those pieces. And similarly, I believe the absolute best way to improve educational outcomes is through choice. And this is something that is threatened in a fundamental way by this effort to nationalize standards and tests.
My name is Will Estrada. I'm an attorney at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. I'm the director of our Federal Relations Department, and I'm a homeschool graduate as well. And I'm here to say that homeschooling works, that parental involvement is the key to education, and that's why the Common Core must be rejected.
So let me start with the most critical issue, in my opinion, for Common Core, which is the academics. Because if we establish first that the academics really are failing our children, that should be the end of the debate right there. So let's just talk about the standards themselves and whether or not they prepare our students for life upon graduation. Lindsey, what do we know about the math standards in Common Core?
Well, we know a few things. We know that the mathematics standards are poorly sequenced, that they don't employ standard algorithms, and that they don't prepare our students to enter selective colleges or pursue fields like science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, so STEM degrees. What we know from all of the content matter experts is that the mathematics standards by 7th grade will put our children 2 years behind their international counterparts, and that at the very best, they prepare them for community college, not a selective 4-year institution. So there are some real fundamental issues with the mathematics standards, and there are great experts who have worked on this, that have looked at the content. Zev Werman out in California, Jim Milgram, who is Professor Emeritus of Mathematics at Stanford, who actually refused to sign off on the mathematics content standards. He was on the Common Core Validation Committee and was so disheartened by what he saw that he actually refused to sign off. So to me, that shows that among the content matter experts, there are some real issues with the mathematics standards.
Let me give you an example of a first grade math problem. And some of you have seen the video that's gone relatively viral on YouTube of a teacher very sweetly trying to explain what 16 minus 4 was. And it took her a minute to do so. But I'm going to give you an example. This is the decomposition of 13 minus 4. Now, there's no memorization or the standards method of multiplication, addition, and subtraction of 13 minus 4. Instead, a first grader So a student who's 6 or 7 years old must explain the math standard this way. 13 minus 4 equals 13 minus 3 minus 1 equals 10 minus 1 equals 9. That's first grade math. So you can understand why parents like myself are infuriated when our daughters bring home homework with math questions in the same manner. Jason Zimba, who is the drafter of the math standards, himself testified before the Massachusetts State Board of Education saying, listen, it's not going to prepare our students for STEM careers, and if you want to take calculus in college, you'll definitely need more than what's in the Common Core. So we know the math itself has already failed our children. What about the English? Lindsey, what can you tell us about the English standards?
One of the biggest critiques we hear on the English standards is that there is a shift toward informational text. So away from great works of literature, away from reading fiction, with much more of an emphasis on informational text. And so if you talk to teachers, and I think the teacher component is really important, you see a real precipitous decline among teachers if you look at Gallup polling and their support for Common Core. Teachers are on the front lines of this. They're seeing the implementation unfold. And what they're saying to us is that about 50% of their instructional materials have to be derived from informational text. And so they only have time for excerpts of great works of literature or poetry. And I think that's been one of the most concerning components of the English language arts standards.
We've heard particularly from Sandra Stotsky, who again was also on the validation committee and also one of the 5 members of the committee that did not sign off on them, refused to do so because she knew the standards would fail the children. She was credited with developing the Massachusetts ELA standards, which are reported to be some of the best in the nation. Unfortunately, Massachusetts has drunk the Kool-Aid, and those are no longer the standards they're using. But she's pointed out that there are glaring omissions of British literature, aside from Shakespeare, standards on authors of the ancient world. This is the Iliad, the Odyssey, any standard on the history of the English language. And by the time we reach high school, you're talking 70% informational, technical texts, 30% great works of art. And professors all over the nation have said this is an unnecessary emphasis on the letters of the text themselves, on the words, as a representation of competency, not on the ideas and the philosophies of great literature, the things that make us more human.
And so if I could just add, while you're losing all of this great emphasis, what are you getting in place of it? You're getting how a brown bag is made. Healthcare cost in McAllen, Texas. This
Absolutely.
is on the recommended reading list. Really exciting and invigorating material for a high school student to read.
Neal, let me ask you a question. We've heard a lot about federalism and the concerns of governmental overreach, but we've heard also from proponents of the Core that this is a state-led effort, that these are really standards and not curriculum, and the government stayed out of it. All we've done is just given states money to promote excellent standards. They just happen to be the Common Core. We really weren't involved at all. What's your response to that?
Right, so a lot of what you hear about the Common Core is, especially if you haven't spent a whole lot of time on it, or as much time as unfortunately I have, is there's a whole lot of subtlety you need to know, and there's a lot of semantics, a lot of parsing of language. So as you mentioned in your introduction, the Common Core did originate with the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. Those are professional organizations, but of state-level officials. So, you know, you're sort of in a gray area, but you might say that that's the state. What we have to be very clear about is, first of all, those organizations, they put out a report in 2008 called Benchmarking for Success that talked about we should get states on common internationally benchmarked standards. This is before they had the name Common Core. And it said the role of the federal government is to incentivize adoption of these standards through funding and regulatory relief. So these people asked for federal intervention. Then the next thing you need to know, as you mentioned, is that you get the recession, the Great Recession, and the stimulus, and part of the stimulus is something called the Race to the Top program. And many of the same people who are working to get national standards, we now know, went to the Obama administration and said, you need to use this to get states to adopt national standards. And so the Race to the Top said, if you want to maximize your chance of winning this money, you have to adopt a set of standards common to a majority of states. And they knew very well that there was only one such set of standards, and that was the Common Core. So you can see that this was intended from the beginning, and also understand this was put into a framework of No Child Left Behind, where the federal government told states you have to have state standards, you have to have state tests, and you are held responsible based on those standards and tests. Now they're saying, and we'll tell you what standards those are. And they selected the people who created the tests and paid for the tests. So this is very clearly federal, and it was intended to be heavily federal from the beginning. But people do need to understand it didn't originate with the federal government, because when you debate Common Core, if you say or you even intimate it might have originated with the federal government, people tell you you're crazy. But you know what you need to know, which is the federal government was the primary driver of this, and it was intended to be that way.
Sarah, can I just drive home Neal's point? This is a really critical point. The way in which we have seen education centralized at the federal level. You know, you start off in 1965, it's just the federal government spending a little bit of money, and then you move through the 90s, you get standards-based reform, you get No Child Left Behind, which for the first time, the federal government said to states, you have to test your kids once every year in grades 3 through 8 and once again in high school. So for the first time, you had the federal government dictating to states the frequency with which they had to test students. That in and of itself was an overreach. And so now, to Neal's point, what you have is the administration not only saying, we're going to require how often you test, but we are going to require what you test. And so you can see in that very abridged history of federal intervention in education just how centralized it's become over the past 4.5 decades.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little more to that then. So the trajectory is clear. First they spend money, then they say, well, we got to know what we're getting for the money, so they say standards and tests. And this gets to where you were asking about whether or not this is curriculum. It's in, again, a very gray area. So the Common Core does leave it to schools to decide what to teach, but it recommends lots of things you should teach, especially in reading. Math is more prescriptive because math by its very nature builds on itself. But then there are the tests, and we actually haven't seen the tests administered yet. We haven't seen the final tests. They fill in a lot of that curriculum, even where the core does not. And the people who are supporting Common Core, many of them said, ultimately they need what's called a tripod. National standards, national tests, national consequences for how schools do on those tests, because it's the only way they feel they can impose what they really think are good things on schools, even though it's highly debatable what they're good. But if you don't have common standards, then different states can say kids are proficient with different definitions. If you don't have common tests with common cut scores, you can just game your tests and set a low proficiency bar, others can do high. And if you don't have common ramifications, then some states and schools could get out of being held responsible. So it's absolutely clear that the ultimate trajectory of this is the federal government dictating curriculum, curriculum, tests, and punishing individual schools based on how they perform on those tests.
Right, and even if it's just a recommended reading list, you can put yourself in the shoes of a teacher who is in a state that has adopted Common Core, whose principal has said we're a Common Core school, the superintendent's on board, and they hand you a recommended reading list. I can imagine if I'm a teacher, I'm going to follow that recommended reading list pretty closely.
Two-point question for Will. First of all, I know we have private schoolers and homeschoolers here. Do they need to be worried about Common Core? Because Common Core right now is a public education issue. And the follow-up to that is, what can a parent do to opt out of Common Core? Is there anything that a parent can do in either a public school or a private school or in a homeschool situation to be opted out? And that's really for the panel as well.
Homeschoolers and private schoolers absolutely need to be concerned about the Common Core. Just last week, Westfield School District in New Jersey sent a letter to a homeschool family saying you are required to follow the Common Core in your homeschool program. They were wrong. We stepped in, we notified that school district that they were wrong. The family does not need to follow the Common Core. Homeschoolers right now are safe from the Common Core. But we're seeing that when we have a nationalized, standardized, one-size-fits-all approach to education, it's only a matter of time before the freedom of homeschool parents and private school parents and private schools to decide what curriculum they want to follow will be thrown under the bus. Homeschool Legal Defense Association was founded in 1983. At that time, homeschooling was illegal in many of the 50 states. By the grace of God, the hard work of homeschool parents and lawyers, homeschooling is legal in all 50 states today, but we have seen as homeschoolers what happens when there's a one-size-fits-all nationalized approach towards education. We must not allow that to happen again. What can parents do if you're fighting the Common Core? If you are in a public school, don't give up. Keep fighting, and I'm so excited to see that parents in public schools, private schools, and homeschools are joining together to fight for parental rights in education. That's what our country is founded on. 1925, Pierce versus Society of Sisters. Our Supreme Court said that the right of parents to direct their education and upbringing of their children is a fundamental right. So keep fighting to take control of the education of your children back from Washington, D.C., back from the elites, into the hands of parents, teachers, and local school boards. But if you're in a homeschool, if you're in a private school program, keep fighting as well. This is an issue that the education of the next generation is so crucial, we cannot give up on it.
Let me talk quickly. He's absolutely right. I want to talk quickly about data collection because some of you have heard what are sort of Orwellian whispers of what's going on with data collection and how we are entered into a mildly police state with Common Core. Now, the Common Core website, and I encourage all of you to visit it, it is corestandards.org, so that you can read for yourself every aspect of the Common Core with all the appendices that are being distributed across the country. Common Core's website states officially no data collection is required under the standards, but data collection is required. So for the panel, can we talk a little bit about where the data comes from and what's required?
One thing I want to point out is in 2011 at the Council of Chief State School Officers, one of the organizations that helped draft the Common Core, they held a conference in 2011, and in that conference we actually have the slideshow that they put up. They said that one of their goals is to include students who are not currently in data collection systems, and they put up e.g. homeschool and private school students. The end goal is to get the data of every student in this country into these national databases.
And I would just add to that, too, that the federal law that had protected student data and privacy, FERPA, was effectively gutted about 3 or 4 years ago. And so there is concern now that student privacy issues, that data could actually be sent over to private entities, whereas before that was protected. So there are concerns with regards to FERPA as well.
Yeah, and I would, just to see the trajectory and understand the logic why this is being done. Lindsey talked about higher education. I do some higher education work, and a lot of people who do Common Core don't know that the goal here, and a lot of it is in higher ed, is to collect information on people from essentially the day they're born through their careers.
Absolutely.
And the intention behind that, again, this may be well-intentioned, is to say, look, if we don't have lots of information about you as a person, right down to things like your bus schedule, what your religion is, all sorts of things like that, we won't be able to control for lots of factors that influence ultimately what kind of job you get and how much you earn, and then we won't be able to decide which school is doing a good job, which is doing a bad job. And that also means they say, look, we have to know lots of things about you from birth so we know whether your pre-kindergarten is doing a good job. And remember, these are called P through 20 W databases. 20 means grade 20, W means workforce, P means pre-kindergarten. So they need that money from, or that information from the very beginning to the end, so that basically social engineers can decide which things you should be allowed to do, what you shouldn't, and what they should do to schools.
Right, and the administration has no problem using the cradle-to-career terminology.
No.
So, I hear that a lot.
They actually think that's a good thing.
Right.
Now, contributing to the trajectory that you just mentioned was a 2013 U.S. Department of Education report entitled Promoting Grit, Tenacity, and Perseverance. In that report were recommendations for where they wanted to use data collection in the future. These were some of the suggestions that the USDE published in this report. We are pulling records from everywhere, billions of records of data. We want a personal dossier that includes healthcare history, disciplinary record, family income, family voting status, religious affiliation, attributes, dispositions, social skills, attitudes, and interpersonal resources. In addition, they propose, and this is from the report itself, eye-tracking devices, posture analysis seats, facial expression cameras, pressurized computer mice, and mood tracking software in schools. These are recommendations. They are not the law yet, praise be to God, but this is the trajectory of information collection through the creation of longitudinal databases required by Race to the Top, underneath Common Core. So does Common Core require data collection? Not in and of itself, but the program under which the money comes does. So the data is coming anyway. So we're almost out of time. Let me end on this note for all of us. And Will, you hit on this a little bit. What are your encouragement for grassroots activism, for parents, grandparents, people who know children in public schools? Because again, first, this is coming through public schools, and eventually, we hope not, to private and home schools as well. What are the steps that a parent or a grandparent can take right now to repeal this? It's already been repealed in 5 states. We still have some time under this momentum. What else can we do?
On July 29th of this year, there was an article on Politico.com called Moms Winning the Common Core War, and the first sentence said it all. The millions have proved no match for the moms. And that is because of the work of people like you and the people who are watching this webcast. Keep fighting. The last 4 words of 1984 by George Orwell are some of the most chilling in the English language. He loved Big Brother. We must fight against this approach that even some in our own party say that we can have nationalized government control over education. It takes a parent, not a village, to raise a child.
Amen. Amen. Well, it will be hard to close after that, but let me also encourage you to visit the websites of all the represented organizations, HSLDA, Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, and also the Family Research Council's website, frc.org/Common Core. We have some video resources in our university library there. But I encourage you to reach out to us individually and also to visit our website for future resources. But again, let me reiterate what Will said. The 2016 elections, there will be a critical emphasis on Common Core. It is going to be a vote maker or breaker, and this is the time for parents to get involved. Thank you.